Emerson's life as a thinker went through three distinct phases. The first phase we can call the idealist phase. This phase is manifested in early essays like Nature from 1836, Self-Reliance, 1841, also The Oversoul and the Transcendentalist. In these essays and others like it, Emerson believes that there is within us some spiritual principle that ultimately allows us to transcend physical limitation. Sometimes he calls this spirit, sometimes he calls it soul, sometimes he calls it mind. But there's a real sense that ultimately we are not merely physical beings. We are not bound by our physiology. There is within us a power to go beyond the flux of time, to gain an insight into beauty, truth, and goodness that are ultimately beyond time, unchanged. Now, it's important to note that the way Emerson imagines getting to this ideal beauty, truth, and goodness is through observation of the natural world. He's not some wispy Neoplatonist who has disdain for matter. On the contrary, Emerson has a deep love of the natural world. And if you'll notice in the essay Nature, again from 1836, there's a tracking of the ladder, we might say, from the most immediate physical understanding of the world as commodity, to an understanding of the natural world as beauty, the natural world as the source of language, the natural world as the source of ethics, and so on. In other words, it's a sort of bottom-up way of pursuing the ideal. And one reason Emerson has this bottom-up method was his interest in natural science, as I discussed in another lecture, in particular his interest in Michael Faraday's work on electromagnetism, which in some ways is a materialization of his idealism. Emerson might say that spirit is the cause of matter, the impetus of matter. Michael Faraday says, well, you know what? That spirit really is electromagnetic energy. So for Emerson, the spirit he believed in and the electromagnetic energy that Faraday proved were analogies for one another. The second phase of Emerson's life as a thinker begins with experience from 1844. As I discussed in another lecture, this essay is a response to the death of Emerson's young child, Waldo, called him Wally, at the age of 5 from scarlet fever. The essay is a long lament on the inability of idealism to address the deep tragedies of life. One may ask, what does it all mean? One may ask, what is truth? What is goodness? But ultimately, the world is too painful, too confusing for us ever to get an answer to these questions. So the middle Emerson is much more attuned to the limitations of the physical world. He's much more realistic, we might say, about how we are shaped very much by our time. We're shaped very much by our environment. We're shaped very much by the experiences we have through life, the physical experiences we have through life. And because of these limitations, we can't gain this spiritual panoramic view, one might say, that he imagined one could find earlier. The hope comes in an essay like Experience in the mind to shape the energies of the physical world into graceful forms. In other words, Emerson moves from being a kind of Platonist in the early phase to a kind of pragmatist in the second phase. We are physical beings, we're limited by physical forces, but we have the mental capability to transform these physical energies into projects, works of art, buildings, ethical principles that address our situation here and now and make it better, that ameliorate that. But these projects, these patterns, these works of art, these worldviews, so on and so forth, can only address a particular moment. They are not eternal. They will not necessarily pertain to what happens to us a day from now, 2 years from now. So thought ultimately is powerful enough to shape experience into graceful forms, but these graceful forms are temporary. They must endlessly be revised and remade. The third phase the third Emerson we see emerge in his book called The Conduct of Life from 1860. And the primary essay in this book is called Fate. Now, Emerson at this point is 57 years old. He lived a long life. Here, this sense that we are controlled by the physical world is much more extreme than it was in experience. Emerson lists over and over again various ways in which we cannot do what we want to do. First of all, we're limited by our genetics. He doesn't use that kind of language, but basically he says that we have body types that limit us. The pseudosciences of physiognomy and phrenology, even though they are not accurate, are onto something, that the way we look will shape how our life is. That's just the beginning. Our parents shape who we are, our city shapes who we are, our teachers, our ministers, so on and so forth. Even more so, we can say, "Oh no, but there are such a I am unique in some way." Well, then Emerson draws on the new science of statistics. Ultimately, they say that, well, no, every generation there is someone just like you. And then we might say, well, no, they're brilliant inventors. And then we'll say, well, no, that invention's been done 10, 15 times before. It'll be done 10, 15 times after. In other words, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just one repetition of these iron laws of fate. And we ultimately have no possibility for originality in this world. It's a thoroughgoing materialist understanding of existence. Now, this is bizarre for a man who started back in 1836 with such an optimistic Neoplatonic way of looking at the world. But there is hope. Yet again, what do we counter fate with? Power. Power. So by the time we get to 1860, Emerson's not so interested in spirit as power, physical force. If one can speak of life metaphorically as we are drowning in an ocean, and we're ultimately going to be sinking down to the bottom of the sea, and there's not a thing we can do about it. Oh no, we can make life vests. Oh, we can build boats. Think of it this way. Fate means that we are like people pushed off a cliff, and we're flinging headlong into an ocean. That's gravity pushing us down. That's fate. There's not a thing we can do about it. We are going to hit that water below us if we were thrown off a cliff over an ocean, say. But we have the choice how we will fall. We can do a flip. We can do a gainer. We can do a swan dive. We can do a jackknife. In other words, we have, through our wits and through our practical powers, the ability to turn those physical energies into ways that are beneficial to us. But again, this sense in fate is that ultimately it is not a spiritual principle that allows us to transcend the physical world. It is more a physical power that we can choose to generate that allows us to manipulate the physical world in ways that make the world feel meaningful to us. So it's the same kind of pragmatism we see in experience, but it's a more thoroughgoing pragmatism, a more physically based pragmatism. Ultimately, we're in a world of force against force, physical force against human force. Luckily, our physical force is strong enough to translate the meaningless isness of life into the oughtness of human desire.